The killing of 2 young police officers in Manchester has highlighted Britain's problem with violent crime.
There's far more highly visible members of organised crime groups who seek to impose fear and maintain their criminal lifestyle through that fear.
So in their fight against organised crime, the authorities are making deals with some of the country's most serious criminals.
Me actually being sentenced for a conspiracy to rob, but not a murder charge. No murder charge.
Even those involved in murder are getting their prison sentences slashed by more than 25 years.
The one thing this cannot be is a get-out-of-jail-free card for serious criminals.
But relying on evidence from criminals has gone wrong in the past.
There should be no countenancing prosecutions based solely on supergrasses.
So why should we trust the supergrass today?
A rat will devour its own to survive. And that's what they're doing. You can't believe any of them.
A sunny afternoon on the seafront at South Shields. An unlikely setting for a gangland killing. But a crime was about to take place that would introduce a new generation of supergrasses. Local drug dealer Noddy Rice was waiting for his supplier, Alan Foster.
I said, you don't want to be getting involved with him. I said, there's something about him that I don't like. And he just said, why no? He says, he's a great lad, him.
But Noddy Rice and Alan Foster had fallen out. Police aren't certain whether it was over drugs, money or a girlfriend. Whatever it was, there was a score to settle.
A family friend knocked on the door and said, have you heard Noddy's been shot? As I was going to go out of the house to go to the hospital, Noddy's best friend phoned and said, Shirley, he's died, you know, he's dead. And the next thing I remember, I must have screamed and collapsed on the floor.
The killers dumped and burnt out their car close to the scene. They had a van standing by. The driver had been told he was taking part in a drugs deal. He had no idea there was going to be a murder. The van driver was Derek Blackburn. We can't show his face.
Gangland killings are few and far between in these parts, but what happened here yesterday bear the hallmarks of exactly that.
Derek Blackburn's van was traced and he was arrested. To start with, he was reluctant to help the murder inquiry.
He initially denied any involvement in the offence and was about to be released from police custody when he indicated that, subject to speaking to his partner, he may be in a position to assist the police and prosecution.
Prosecutor Kingsley Highland was able to offer a pioneering deal. He used recently introduced supergrass laws and became one of the country's leading experts on them. The getaway van driver Derek Blackburn would be one of the first criminals in the country to benefit. Since 2006, the Crown Prosecution Service has been allowed to offer straightforward contracts to criminals like Blackburn. If they give evidence in court against serious offenders, they'll be rewarded with a reduced jail sentence or even a promise they won't be prosecuted themselves.
The most important thing is that we require them to tell the truth. The point about that being that if at any point we can demonstrate they haven't told the truth, we then have the possibility that we can, in effect, tear up this written agreement, go back and perhaps prosecute them for perjury or for perverting the course of justice.
Supergrasses, or assisting offenders as they're called, are supposed to be minor criminals who've been encouraged to testify against more serious players.
We would never put forward someone for assisted offender who is the most serious offender. We always look at subordinates to the key offence itself. For an example, someone who maybe have driven a car away from an offence, as opposed to someone who struck the fatal blows in an offence.
After the shooting in South Shields, prosecutors had signed up a textbook example of the new supergrass, getaway van driver Derek Blackburn. The gunman, Alan Foster, fled the country and has never been caught. But his accomplice was put on trial, so Derek Blackburn did give evidence against him. When Stephen Bevans heard the Supergrass evidence in court, he immediately changed his plea to guilty of murder and was sentenced to life. Supergrass Derek Blackburn did well out of the deal. Despite admitting a part in the murder and drug dealing, his jail sentence was much reduced.
What would he have got compared to the sentencing he ultimately ended up with?
He was looking at 12 years.
Compared to?
Eventually 2.5.
Bringing one of Noddy Rice's killers to justice was clearly in the public interest. But the people who most needed to know that justice had been done were his family. They had to come to terms with one of those involved getting off lightly.
Well, it was hard at first because I'm thinking, has this man come and took them to where that he's taken them and they've murdered my brother and he's getting away with it? But when we've been to court, I just thought he's definitely telling the truth. He's definitely never been involved in this.
Do you think the authorities are right to use these deals?
Yes. In cases like this, yes, definitely.
New figures released today show the authorities are using them more and more. Since 2006, there have been 175 Supergrass deals. The courts have said that only in exceptional cases will prison sentences be cut by more than 2/3. But Panorama has traced and analysed 49 Supergrass cases. In 21 of them, the Supergrass's sentence was cut by more than 2/3. And 13 Supergrass witnesses had their jail terms slashed by more than 80%.
On the one hand, of course, the public expects, and it's the business of the Crown Prosecution Service, to prosecute people who've committed criminal offences. On the other hand, Parliament has said that, as a matter of principle, we should consider using witnesses who are perhaps not our most admirable citizens, because they may have committed offences themselves, to bring other, more serious criminals to justice.
The price of solving the most serious crimes can sometimes be even higher.
Early yesterday evening, 11-year-old Rhys Jones was shot dead by a teenager on a bike. Police say he was an innocent victim.
In a handful of cases, 7 since the new laws came in, Supergrasses have been rewarded with total immunity from prosecution.
Someone knows who's done it. And I know people must be frightened, but they've got to think that they can't leave this killer out there.
Police got an anonymous tip-off telling them who'd shot Rhys Jones, but people were too frightened to come forward with hard evidence. Then there was a breakthrough. Detectives found the gun used to kill Rhys at the home of a 16-year-old gang member. Boy X, as he became known, told the police he'd been given the gun to hide by this teenager, Sean Mercer, within half an hour of the murder. For the first time, there was a chance of catching the killer. But to do that, prosecutors had to make a deal with a gang member involved in covering up a child's murder.
When we became aware of a youth who could potentially be a very valuable witness by putting a murder weapon in the hand of Sean Mercer, it was obvious that we had to give serious consideration as to whether it was in the interest of justice to approach him more as a witness than as a possible defendant.
The CPS decided to use a Supergrass deal to charge Sean Mercer with murder. To convict Mercer, they were prepared to go as far as the new laws allow, to offer not just a sentence reduction, but total immunity from prosecution.
We looked at the other options and we decided that the issue of an immunity notice would enable us to manage the witness and to control the witness better than the other options. We made absolutely clear to Boy X what he had to do to secure immunity.
As a result of Boy X's evidence, Sean Mercer was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Supergrass evidence had again been crucial, but this time it came at a higher price: total immunity from prosecution. But even the murdered boy's parents thought the Supergrass deal was a good one.
I think it was. I mean, to secure the conviction of the main offenders was of priority, and the information that he gave to the police, it was a good trade-off, so to speak.
Was it difficult for you to accept the idea of him not being punished?
No, if he'd have played a bigger role, perhaps I would have been a bit more worried about the fact that he's walking away scot-free. But the actual, what he actually did was minimal to an extent.
Supergrasses have a controversial history. Deals were often done with the police, and sometimes hidden. It led to trouble. In the 1970s, there was an epidemic of armed robberies in London. It was cleared up using supergrasses.
There is no doubt at all that this is fundamentally a good system.
But these supergrasses were often notorious villains, keen to stay out of jail.
To get myself off the hook, put someone in it, you know. It's cold-blooded, isn't it?
But some deals were corrupt. Supergrasses became crooked witnesses who lied in court in return for favours from the police.
These grasses are just using the police to stay out of prison, and the police are just using these grasses to further their own careers.
Case after case collapsed. The work of leading defence lawyers, like Michael Mansfield, led to the use of supergrass evidence being totally discredited.
The thing that used to happen in the 1980s, and it's happening again right now, is that, yes, these people will know about crime, but in order to inveigle their way into the favours, they dress it up. They dress it up in the way that they put people at the scene who weren't there, even though they were. And of course they have, access to grind. They have, vendettas to settle. So that's why I think there should be no countenancing prosecutions based solely on supergrasses.
Today's supergrasses are no different. Relying on their evidence is as risky as ever.
What are you hoping to achieve by speaking to us today?
Sonny Stewart is charged with murder, but he's found a way out by becoming a supergrass.
Hopefully, me actually getting sentenced for a conspiracy to rob and not murder charge. No murder charge, basically.
Sonny Stewart was charged with a particularly brutal murder.
At 7 o'clock on Wednesday night, a gang of men, probably 4, burst into his home on Sticker Lane, beating Mr. Simpson ferociously.
The gang had been looking for money. When they couldn't find it, they tortured and beat Teddy Simpson to death. Police had CCTV of the gang from Leeds arriving in a white van. Sonny Stewart admitted he'd helped recruit them, but he denied going anywhere near the victim's house himself.
I thought I was gonna threaten him and, you know what I mean? No, I didn't believe there was any serious harm gonna come to this guy.
But the robbery ended in murder. Dead or dying, Teddy Simpson was taken from his home in the white van. His body was dumped in woodland. Sonny Stewart admitted he'd been in touch with the gang throughout. Police eventually charged 7 men with murder, including Sonny Stewart. But when Sonny Stewart signed a supergrass contract, the Crown Prosecution Service reduced his murder charge to manslaughter. They accepted his story that he'd had no idea the robbery would end in violence.
If a number of men agree to carry out a violent robbery and organise a violent robbery and the victim dies as a consequence of the violence, then they are guilty of murder. And there's no room for manslaughter in that situation. What was going on here was a fiction, effectively. A bogus charge which was created for Sonny Stewart's benefit.
I think we need to get back to these papers, me. Stick to the papers, keep it simple.
Right from the start, there were doubts about Sonny Stewart's account. In court, he insisted that only 3 men had attacked Teddy Simpson. 2 of them black, 1 of them white. Errol Witter, DeCosta Daniel, and Robert Cameron. But an eyewitness said something different. Gary Folkard had called at the house during the robbery. He too had been savagely beaten. He told police there might have been a 4th gang member. The 3 he could describe were all black.
I said no, they were definitely all 3 of them or 4 of them were Jamaican. Yeah. I'm still confused as to whether there were 3 or 4. Okay. All 3 of them men were dark, like Afro-Caribbean people, They were all Jamaican fellas.
And at first, Sonny Stewart had also told police that 3 black men were involved.
Just the threat of 3 big black guys going in with a replica gun. He not knowing it was a replica. Them slapping him about a bit, sitting him down, saying, "Where's your money?" I was under the impression he'd just say, "Yeah, here it is." You know what I mean?
What did you expect them to do?
Well, 2 black guys and a white guy. But you'd have thought 3 black guys. You know what I mean? He'd have thought just guys from out of town.
Why would he think there were 3 black guys?
Probably the way they were masked up. I think I said just the 3 black guys then because of all the statements I've been reading since I've been...
It's not easy, is it?
No, it's not me.
It's clear on watching that interview that he slipped and realised that he'd slipped because he laughed nervously and then corrected himself. And his final version was that there were 2 black men and 1 white man who were to attack Mr. Simpson.
Just the 3 men identified by Sonny Stewart were convicted of attacking and killing Teddy Simpson. There was plenty of other evidence they were at the murder scene. But Sonny Stewart was the crucial witness against the other defendants, including this man, his friend Anthony Davis.
They were like cousins. They were just like cousins. You know what I mean? It was just, if you saw Anthony, you knew Sonny weren't too far away.
Sonny Stewart and Anthony Davis were drug dealers. On the night of the murder, Sonny Stewart said they were together. He said they had both played a part in the robbery, but Anthony Davis was always in charge, even using Sonny Stewart's phone to give the orders.
All this time, Anthony's got my phone because he's the one directing the matters. So we're talking about my phone, but he's the one who's got it. You with me?
At a second trial, 4 more men were found guilty of robbery or murder. Anthony Davis was sentenced to a minimum of 35 years, largely on the evidence of Sonny Stewart.
He used his get out of jail free card. That's what Sonny Stewart did. And the system bought into it.
Sonny Stewart could have been sentenced to 30 years. He got just 7. He's since been released. The judge told Sonny Stewart he'd been lucky, but for his Supergrass deal with the prosecution, he would have been convicted of murder.
Pleading guilty to manslaughter and to conspiracy to rob reflected the prosecution's view of the evidence. Sonny Stewart's evidence was backed up by the available evidence. The jury convicted, and the Court of Appeal said that that conviction was safe. We regard it, as I say, as a principled decision. It wasn't just some deal that was done for the sake of it.
Anthony Davis is locked up in a top security prison. The Criminal Cases Review Commission has recently decided to investigate his conviction. Whether or not Supergrass evidence can be relied on is once again an issue.
If there has been a potential miscarriage of justice, and moreover, a violent murderer is now free after spending a very short period in prison, it's very difficult to see what the public interest has been.
In the past, Supergrass cases gained a reputation for unravelling.
But now we're told that these new arrangements are safer. Supergrasses, like Sonny Stewart, are meant to sign formal agreements to tell the truth. And it's that openness, that transparency, that attempt to keep everything above board that should be at the heart of each new Supergrass prosecution.
Good morning, very warm welcome to the Swiss Ward 925 Good Street, Newcastle.
The new Supergrass laws were brought in because the police and prosecutors believed they were losing the fight against organised crime. Whether that threat is growing is difficult to prove, but every city has its violent criminals. Newcastle upon Tyne is no exception.
We have evidence that the gunman lay in wait to kill Mr. Knight, and we certainly cannot rule out the possibility that it was as a result of a feud.
Gangster Freddie Knights was shot dead on his mother's doorstep. Police suspected he'd been killed by rivals. The chief suspect was John Sayers, a leading member of a well-known Tyneside crime family.
My dad and his brothers and his cousins, they've all been in prison. My dad got shot. My younger brother Michael, he got shot 6 times and survived. In 1990, I got 15 years for conspiracy to rob. 2007, I got 4 years for tax evasion. And in between that, I've had 2-3 years on remand for different offences.
John Sayers and some of his associates were charged with the murder of Freddie Knights.
They said I had organised it.
How?
By planning it.
The murder trial was moved to Leeds amid high security. Armed police brought the defendants to court. Surveillance teams filmed everyone arriving. Despite the huge effort, there was still a serious security breach. A juror was phoned and threatened. Police investigated, but couldn't link it to anyone, so the trial carried on. 3 men were convicted of manslaughter, but not John Sayers.
John Henry Sayers was acquitted of all the charges after the 3-month trial at Leeds Crown Court.
Although John Sayers was now a free man, he believed he would always be a police target.
I knew they would leave us alone for a short while because they had been embarrassed. So I knew they would be coming back. Didn't know when or where, but I knew they'd be back.
7 years later, events at the murder trial came back to haunt him. A supergrass came forward with dramatic new evidence that John Sayers had been behind the attempt to nobble the juror. This man, Errol Hay, was a Newcastle criminal and paid police informer. Hay claimed that during a visit to the court, he'd been instructed to make the threatening telephone call.
The only day he was there was when everything was explained in open court as to what had happened the night before. And that's where he learned about it. I knew he was an informer from years ago, so I didn't have anything to do with him.
Did you know him?
I knew him, yeah.
And what was he like?
Drug addict, little weasel.
Errol Hay said he'd been told what to do by John Sayers. Hay took police officers to this former mining village near Newcastle. He showed them the phone box he'd made the call from. The police already knew this was the correct phone box. They'd traced the threatening phone call soon after it had been made. This was the vital corroboration they needed before taking the word of a supergrass.
If we are unable to corroborate what they have to say, or if we are able as a result of that exercise to contradict what they have to say, then it's extremely unlikely that we will be advancing them as credible witnesses of truth.
Following his success in the Noddy Rice murder case, prosecutor Kingsley Highland now signed a supergrass contract with Errol Hay, who was given an alias. John Sayers was charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice.
What would have been the personal consequences of it going all the way?
Dying in jail.
The entire case relied 101% on Hay telling the truth. This was a one-witness case, and he was either telling the truth or he was not.
But some in the prosecution team already knew that Hay was telling lies. He'd beefed up his story by telling the police he'd made not just one phone call to the juror in Leeds, but 2. Again, he took them to the phone box he said he'd used.
But this time when the police checked, there'd been no phone call. They couldn't find any record of anyone calling Leeds that night. And it called Hay's credibility into question. If he couldn't be believed about this call, why should he be believed about making that first threatening call?
The CPS knew, but the defence didn't, that no such call to Leeds that night could have been made from any of 48 boxes that were trawled and investigated within a 3-mile radius. If I had had this material when I was cross-examining Hay over, I think, 2 or 3 days, I would have exploded him as a witness of truth, and yet it was denied to the defence.
The jury nobbling case came to an abrupt end when the defence obtained the phone records that showed Hay was lying. They only got them late in the day from a police officer. They should have been handed over much earlier by the CPS.
The judge was highly critical of the prosecution, saying there'd been a deliberate, conscious decision to flout the rules. He then ordered the trial be stopped.
The person who failed to disclose the key evidence revealing the supergrass had lied was the senior prosecutor, Kingsley Highland. The CPS refused to allow Mr. Highland to answer questions about this himself.
Would you categorise this as a gross failure?
The material should have been disclosed, and it wasn't, and it led to the halting of the prosecution. That has been a very painful experience for everybody concerned, and that case, together with 1 or 2 other ones, have meant that we're now dealing with disclosure with new systems in place to make sure that this sort of thing never happens again.
Errol Hay died of cancer shortly after giving his evidence. His supergrass contract to tell the truth turned out not to be worth the paper it was written on.
It's too easy for anybody to go and tell lies without there being any fear of reprisal by the system. Once you accept it as a supergrass, that's it. You can say whatever you want.
Isn't the point that the new system actually can't change the nature of these defendants, and we are in exactly the same place as we were when this system was discredited?
All I can say to you is that you have to make a decision in each individual case. We reject far more of these proposed agreements than we agree to. It is only when it is clear to us that we can put a witness forward in a way that will most benefit the public interest and convict serious criminals of very serious offences when we might not otherwise be able to.
The new generation supergrass is too valuable to be ignored. So too was the old generation, until they were thoroughly discredited. Next week, we investigate how powerful lobby groups helped create laws which protected the gunman in one of the most controversial killings in recent US history.
Making sense of the reason why a man of rhyme was murdered. New Tricks is here next. BBC Three takes off on a conspiracy road trip, challenging creationism. Magnificent Machines on BBC Four. Strap yourself in for the golden age of the British sports car in a time shift documentary.